Hi, everyone. This is Rob Gray from ASU and the Perception Action Podcast. This is a presentation that I will be giving at the Sport Movement Skill Conference this year, titled "The Art and Science of Constraints-Based Coaching." The blending of art and science is kind of the theme of the conference, so I thought I would give my thoughts with this and some of the things I've observed with regards to this topic. So the first thing, I found this quote from Leonardo da Vinci that I really like. To develop a complete mind, study the science of art, study the art of science, learn how to see, realize that everything connects to everything else. So there's two things that I really like about that I'm going to emphasize in this presentation. One is I don't think this dichotomy between art and science is very useful anymore, especially when it pertains to coaching. Everyone knows there's an art to coaching and there's a science to coaching. We need to mix the two, right? Not keep it as separate dichotomies. And one thing I really love about this quote, I think where this really shows itself most strongly is how we observe, how we look at we observe practice and how we approach practice in terms of what we're seeing. So that's what I want to kind of focus on today. Okay, so obviously the constraints that we're going to look at the constraints that approach. Obviously, there's a science behind the constraints that approach. I've talked about it 100 times, right? It's ecological dynamics, which actually has two bodies of science behind it: ecological psychology and coordination dynamics. Back in episode 376, if you want to go check it out, I talk about why we need both of those together and how they work together so well. There's a clear logic so what I like to do with coaches when I, do education workshops and stuff, the thing that I'm really want them to get is the logic of the constraints that approach. What are we trying to do to achieve, right? We're trying to destabilize or take away a particular movement solution, encourage the performer to perform somewhere else, and self-organize, amplify information, maybe provide some sort of transition feedback through the manipulation of constraints. To me, that's the most important thing you can get out of studying the constraints that approach in the science, the logic of it. Why am I using a water bag here? Right? People that don't take the time to do that, they just try to copy and paste. They may use it for the wrong person, right? Not everything fits everyone. So there's a real clear logic and rationale and science behind all of this, which I've talked about many times on the podcast, right? When we let the athlete explore, there's great work by Carl Newell and Pacheco, and for example, they've talked about the science of how we search for solutions and how we settle on a solution. And of course, we're getting into the science of attractors here, right? The idea that there's metastable equilibrium, stable equilibrium. And so there's a lot of science to that, right? That I've talked about on the podcast as well, how bifurcation versus a shift, right? So there's a lot of good work done on this, the science of this, right? Following this approach, following a constraints-led approach. Okay, and of course, I mentioned this many, many times now. If you go to perceptionaction.com/comparative, there's an ever-growing body of research, so scientific research, scientific publications that provides evidence for the benefits of things like the constraints-led approach, right? So if you go there, so there's lots of science behind this, right? That to say, right? That's all this to say. There's lots of science behind the constraints-led approach. Okay. Well, one of the things I've noticed, I'm sure everybody that's tried to use it, is using and actually applying the constraints-led approach as much an art as it is a science, right? There's a different science. You need to understand the logic, you need to understand the thing, but a lot of to make it work there's an art to it, right? That's really what I want to point out today. And so, as I mentioned, I don't think this dichotomy is that useful anymore, right? So, what I want to do is kind of contrast the two. If we look at, by that, I mean we need to change our science to reflect more of the art and our art to reflect more of the science, right? So, I think they need to work together, not as separate things. So, kind of if we bin science and art, right? I've put up a few things that I think are really important here. The kind of key characteristics, right? Science, we're aiming for objectivity, right? We want objectivity. We want to measure something, right? The classic image you have is a scientist in a white lab coat standing back, observing something without influencing it. We want scientific control, right? We want to control things very precisely so we know what's going on in each group. We're comparing groups, right? And we're collecting data from groups, calculating the mean using an ANOVA, classic statistics. Um, when we do, and this I've done this in some of my published studies on the constraint side approach, right? So when we're doing a study, right, we have to give the exact same instruction to everybody in the same everyone in the constraints group versus the traditional group, prescriptive group, for example. We want those two things to be the same for everybody in those groups so we can compare them. We're giving the same training to all the athletes in each group, right? Obviously, in a scientific approach, we have correct and incorrect outputs, right, that we're seeing. And we're talking about, a lot of, science is based on linear, predictable interactions, right? So that's kind of what I characterize the key points of science, right? The science of studying motor learning and skill acquisition. The art of it, right? The art of it is, and what this is one of the things I think we need to change, right? The art of it is, subjectivity, right? The coach is part of the system, whether they want to believe it or not. You cannot stand passively back and not influence what's going on. One of the dirty secrets we've come to embrace over the years is we need to focus on the individual. Understanding groups doesn't really tell us very much, right? It goes against all the things we were taught in research methods, but the scientific method, having control, understanding things in the groups, right, is not how we want to do it when we actually want to apply. Third, we want to adapt training based on individual constraints and individual and intrinsic dynamics, right? So we don't want to give the same training constraint to every athlete on our team. That's dumb. That's not the logic of it at all, right? We need to adapt it and choose the constraints based on the individual. We need to accept nonlinear pedagogy. Learning is going to emerge at different times. So the standard, we train for 6 weeks and do a pre and post test doesn't really work that well because we're not expecting everyone to have this. Right? Instead of there being correct or incorrect ways to do it, we want individuality, creativity. We were expecting emergent, unpredictable, interactive behaviors when we set a constraint, right? We're not expecting something simple, a simple change to happen, right? So I want to dive into each of these a little more, right? So the coach is part of the system, right? So the idea that we can stand back and wear a lab coat and be objective and influence things, we need to get rid of that. Both in the way we coach and the way we study it. The work of Greg Wood and Keith Davids and colleagues applying a CLA to coaching, where the coach is a part of the system, right? You cannot remain completely objective and removed from a coaching, right? You have to get in there, right? And I think this is captured really nicely in some of the recent work in that paper as well. The difference between it being adapted and adaptable, right? Adapted is going through coach education and learning how you adjust your training methods to a specific environment. Okay. So we develop knowledge about when I have an athlete that struggles with this, I do that. Right. And it's very path dependent. I do the same thing everyone else did. Right. That's being adapted. Being adaptable, right, is learning to relate and adjust to the specific things, information in front of you, right? So adapting to what's in front of you, not having a cookie cutter thing for when I have an athlete that's struggling this way, I do this. Being able to engage with what you're seeing in the moment, develop through a knowledge of. And I love this quote from Craig Morrison. I think this mirrors nicely the Leonardo da Vinci quote I started with. Craig Morris, it's a journey of learning to pay attention, of being prepared, skillfully stretching towards things that are there, but never overplanned, remained open, responsive to emergent possibilities along the way. So, right, that's the art of it, right? Being engaging with what you're seeing in front of you, not from some template that you've learned, but actually picking up affordances of your athletes, information. It's the same way that the athlete is picking. So it's seeing the world a little bit differently as a coach. Okay. Um, once, one I think the art of how that fits into the art, I think, the term I'm growing more and more using with people I work with is guided self-organization. Okay. So we've said this point many times in the constraint set approach, you don't just set it and forget it. You don't just create a new constraint and don't do anything, right? You want to guide the athlete in some ways based on adding a new constraint, changing instructions, which are a type of informational constraint. And I really think that, to me, I've said this a few times, I think this is the secret sauce of coaching, what you do next, right? Um, you know, how you combine constraints and how you combine physical constraints and informational constraints, i.e. cues, whether you add another constraint, whether you I'm a really increasingly big fan of, you know, for me, there's a big difference saying you have to bend your knees when you do this, saying that to start versus when you set a constraint and say, have you tried bending your knees more? Right. That's just a guide to a certain part of movement space. Right. So that's for me is a real art part of this. Right. So, and I think this is a really key point. Using an ecological point doesn't preclude you from stepping in and guiding the athlete. Okay. But it's used for a different purpose. And this is from my Roots versus Branches presentation, right? We're using it as a transition, a guide. Hey, why don't you go over there and check that part of movement space out rather than where we want them to be, the end solution, right? So I think there's a real art to that, right? It's a real, I was recently, I talked to the Spurs. I was talking to San Antonio Spurs and Greg Popovich, who's a well-known, famous coach. He said, "There's a little fuzziness to this, isn't there?" And I said, "Yep, there sure is. Right? That's where the art, how you move and guide someone is not. There's not strict rules because it's not a strict linear process, right? There's an art to. You have to be able to, like Craig said, be observant and see what's happening, pick up information about your athlete's affordances, and so on. Okay. The other, I mentioned moving away from the science. Everyone knows this. We've been denying it for the longest. Good coaching is individualized, right? I know it's a pain when you have 12 kids in front of you, but if you want to get better, you have to individualize the constraint, right? To that what the athlete is doing. There's not one size fit. There's not one constraint that will work well for everybody. Um, for me, this is the key measure, enduring message I take from Anders Ericsson in deliberate practice. We get better by practicing things we're not already good at, right? That's how we have to know the individual, what their strengths and weaknesses are when designing constraints and go from there. Okay. So some of that, here's a quote from my first book. Good coaching is a renovation, not a new build, right? So individualized coaching, we have to recognize we're building on what the athlete is already bringing to the practice, right? It's not a completely blank slate. And this I'm just trying to show, right? A connection ball might be in baseball pitching, might be good for one athlete. It's not good for every pitcher on your team, right? It's not necessary. It's a specific constraint designed for a specific purpose, right? Specific logic. It doesn't go, just throw it at every player. It probably wouldn't hurt them, but you're not getting efficient use of practice time. Okay. Um, so there's the so I think we need to move away from here. Show me what I need. So drills I use an ecological approach. I think that's fine. Giving examples of how we use constraints is okay. But treat them as possibilities, not prescriptions, not things that you have to do, right? And I think that's a really important thing. So, this is from also my previous presentation. Almost any methodology you can think of can be used in a manner that's consistent with the constraints that approach or ecological approach, because it's a theory and a philosophy of how to guide skill acquisition. It's not a set of tools, right? So I think that's a really key point I keep making over and over. So that's part of the art, right? So one of the things I like to do is I work with coaches creating a constraints matrix. Like, well, what are all the possible things can vary? How? What might they afford? But in no way do I want coaches to go just use like a if this then that approach, right? Be creative. Like a thing I love about the constraints that approach is it creates creativity in the athlete, but also allows creativity in the coach. Some of the constraints that coaches I work with come up with are amazing. I would have thought of that. I think I encourage that. That's a part of the art of it as well. The last, this is a figure from Franz Bosch I like to use from his book Anatomy and Agility. One of the things that we don't often think about with constraints, right, is they're interactive, right? So you have your organism, so they're like ripples in a pond. We have organismic constraints, your individual constraints, your intrinsic dynamics. We have the particular environment we're practicing in that day, and then as a coach, we add task constraints. Those are going to interact in typical, unpredictable, emergent behavior, right? So in the constraint side approach, we're not being unscientific and not having a rationale. We're accepting that the science is complex, right? We're accepting that we're complex systems and there's not a simple linear predictable science, right? So to me, it's just accepting that fact, right? And so you get this kind of emergent, unpredictable behavior that comes out through the interaction of constraints. Okay. So we need part of what the art and science of this. We need to embrace, like I said, the complexity and nonlinearity of learning, right? So in the ecological approach and constraints of we're accepting that this is a fact, right? So we need to come up. This is a big challenge of, how do we know whether things are working? We need to think differently than measuring one variable, performance variable, and seeing how it changes. One of the big things I look for when I first put in a constraint is the person exploring? Are they attempting to take the new affordances I want them to take? Right. So in baseball, if I do an occlusion or something like that, do some constraint, or are they waiting a bit longer to swing, right? That's all I wanna see initially, right? I want to just see, are they trying is the constraint I added trying something different? Is it kind of in the direction I was hoping? So I'm looking more at the process than just the results. Um, these when we know new coordination patterns will emerge at different times in different ways, depending on the individual, we're just accepting that. We're embracing this. We're so we're being willing to be adaptable again. We're observing things in terms of what's the information there, what are the affordances there. We're not being adapted where this happens, then I do that. Okay, so I think that's a really key point. The thing I think the way these are blended, we need a new science of skill acquisition that reflects this, right? With affects all this subjectivity, the nonlinearity, all these that we really want to be studying individuals, not groups. And a good example of this, I'm lucky enough to have a paper with Luis Uhara, is the what he called contextualized skill acquisition research, right? So, and he's got a few papers. I've reviewed these previous podcasts, right? So we're having accept the fact that you're part of the system as the coach of the research, and so being directly involved is okay. Okay, we're not trying to maintain distant objectivity. Um, we're being subjective is okay, right? And we're going to do multi method. So I think this is really the way we need to go, studying the individual, because that's how that's where learning happens. That's how it happens, right? So, what I think, the way that we should blend this, I think we need to start, right? If you're just diving into the constraint set approach, I think you need to understand the science and the logic behind it. And you need to start with a clear logic of what constraints you're using and why, right? So, and I said there's a constraints matrix. I like to use that as a tool, right? If I'm going to give a baseball bat or a heavier bat or a pitcher a connection ball or play this small side game with the rules, right? What's the logic of that? What can I manipulate and why am I having to achieve, right? So you need to start out with a clear logic and plan, but after that, you need to be incredibly flexible, right? Because because of the way learning happens, the interaction between constraints, the nonlinearity, it's not very often it's going to follow a straight path after that, right? So you need to be adaptable. You need to be ready, pick up information, see how people are adjusting to your constraints, and jump in and guide self organization with new constraints, with new instructions, things like that. So I think that's really how we can blend the science and art of using a constraint set approach. Okay, that's it for this presentation. Cheers for now and keep them coupled.